Yes. Okay. All right. I think we can start. So, welcome everybody. My name is Hudzik. I'm a technical lead at Miquido. Miquido is a software house based here in Krakow. Originally we were focusing on mobile, now we also do some backend, frontend and big data. Since I've joined Miquido, it's over 3 years ago, we grew from about 30 people to over 150. And during that time, as we grew, at some point we have recognized that people joining our company have very small knowledge about the legal side of software development. In general, we tend to know such terms as copyright, open source, maybe software license, but very often this knowledge is very generic or simply wrong. Also, a lot of people just don't really care about all that legal stuff. And I believe it's not only the matter of Miquido, I think this is something much more common in IT world. A lot of people think that we are developers, we are maybe project managers, QA engineers, we are not the lawyers, so should we really care about all that legal side of software development? So the aim of this presentation and my role here is to convince you that yes, indeed, we should care about it. So we will start with some theory, then I will give you some hopefully practical tips how we can apply them in our daily development. Just before we get to that, one reservation. Law itself is very wide, pretty complex area. There's a reason for people studying it for many years. Well, so copyright law is not an exception here. It also has some very detailed regulations, exceptions, and so on. So during this presentation, I will cover this area on very basic level, on the level I believe every developer should be familiar with. And we're not good at it, because I think this knowledge is very small among developers. This will also be some level I believe can be applied to vast majority of cases in development. But still, there will be many very specific cases, exceptions, and so on. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal counselor of any kind. So whenever at our company we have any doubt about it, we consult our lawyers. So that's also something I recommend. So please just keep in mind that this won't be any professional legal advice from me. I just want to give you some overview of this topic to awaken the awareness among developers. So having said that, we can get to theory itself. So what does software license actually mean? So in general, this is kind of legal act. Yeah, it imposes some obligations and also some restrictions on software users. It answers such questions as if we can use it in commercial or even private purposes. Can we copy and modify its source code and later distribute it? And what requirements we have to fulfill to do it correctly and with the law. As with every legal act, not applying those in our life can have some legal repercussions on ourselves, but also on our companies or even on our customers. In general, I think there are two most common cases when we have anything to do with software licenses. Firstly, when we are developing our application and at some point we find some piece of software we would like to use, like some library, plugin, script, framework, whatever. So it has probably been released under some software license, which we should take into account. In second case, when we want to release our own application, that's also the moment when we should think about license. Actually, we should think about license upfront, but moment of releasing application is really the last moment probably when we should apply some license on it. In my presentation, I will mainly focus on the first one, because I believe it is much more common and probably it applies to all of us here. So, in general, in modern software development, we hardly never implement something from beginning to very end just ourselves. In general, there's hundreds of thousands different libraries, frameworks, and so on, developing, already resolving some common problems for us. And it's totally fine to use them. There's really no point in reinventing wheel on and on. However, we must remember that using any piece of software comes also with some responsibilities coming from its license. And that's something developers should pay special attention to. Because in our daily work, as we develop our applications, every day we do some crucial decisions. We choose an architecture for our application, we implement business logic, we do some security improvements, and that's fine, that's normal, right? Doing all that, sometimes we also do some mistakes, causing some bugs in end products, which also happens. I think it's common experience of all of us. And important thing here is that decision if and how to use some license is really yet another aspect of our daily work, which we can do right or where we can do some mistakes. But in contrast to those, let's call them regular bugs we tend to do, which can be easily fixed in the next release of our application, applying some license incorrectly can have much more severe repercussions. Firstly, our application can be reported, or we can even be sued, or we or our company, which may end up with shutting down our application or some financial fines. Yes, it may happen. Secondly, we also then have to, even if our application is not shut down, we have to update it to comply with the license, and that is not always that easy. For instance, there are some licenses, I will cover them in a second, which obligate us to publish our source code, to make it open, which is usually not an option in commercial projects. In that case, we have to remove that library and replace it with something else, or implement it from the scratch. So you can imagine how much effort it may take, and it all begins with one wrong decision of development team at some point. So I hope you can see that this legal side of software is something we should really care about, have it in our head. So maybe now let's go through some different types of licenses and see what obligations and restrictions they bring. I will go from the least restrictive ones to those which put most obligations on us. So in such case, you should start with something named public domain. In case of public domain, there's really no ownership of such software. There's no copyright, no trademark, no patent. Well, technically, public domain is not even a license because there has to be copyright for a license to apply. But it's still a group of software we may meet in our development. We can freely modify, distribute, or sell such software. We can literally do anything what you want with it. In order to be part of public domain, software must have never been copyrighted to begin with. For instance, works authorized by US government by its employees in their working time are automatically in public domain. One important note here. If some software has no license, it does not automatically mean it's public domain. It's not. It has been true in the past when public domain was much more popular in software development. However, since 1988, if author wants to make his soft into public domain, he must explicitly state that. So no license does not mean public domain. It is actually opposite. I will get to that in a second. Here are some most notable examples of public domain software, so you can see it's not really that much. On Android and iOS we use SQLite, maybe some others, but in general new libraries are hardly ever released under public domain. But if you ever encounter such, then yes, you can absolutely use it in both private and commercial usages with no strings attached. Okay, that was public domain. Next, we enter the widest and probably the most interesting group of licenses, which is free and open source software, generally referred as open source. So what does it mean open source, and what does make a license an open source? What criteria does it have to meet? So there is actually some authority responsible for reviewing and approving licenses as open source conformant, called Open Source Initiative. On its side, there's a definition of open source and some criteria every license has to meet in order to be open source. Some most notable ones are that it must allow modification and distribution of source code, it must be distributed for free, and it also cannot be limited to any groups of people or any technology or anything like that. So those characteristics are common for all the open source licenses. However, there are also some differences between them. Some of them are crucial from developers' point of view. Most important division here is into two subcategories, permissive and copyleft. So let's discuss them now. As we go from least restrictive ones, we should start with permissive licenses. They are sometimes also called non-protective or BSD style. To this group belong such licenses as MIT, Apache, or BSD, which nowadays are really the most popular licenses on the market. Vast majority of all Android or all libraries commonly used in Android or iOS are released under one of these. I think it's about 75% of all GitHub projects which are released under one of those licenses. In general, those licenses allow us to do anything. However, there is one restriction. In order to properly use some software released under license, some permissive license, we are obligated to inform users that we use such license, such library, and also other information under what license it has been released. It is called attribution. How can we achieve it on mobile? So in general, we should somewhere in our application, we should put that information with the list of libraries and their licenses. The most common approach here is to add a separate screen in settings and about section. I've actually went through some most popular applications on the market to see if and how they comply with that requirement. So here are a couple examples. So most Google applications like YouTube, which you can see here, does it just as I described. In the About section, there is this open source screen, open source licenses screen. If you click any of them, you will see its license. It is the most common, I think probably the simplest and simply the best solution to do that. Here's another example from Google, this time Google Maps. Here information about those libraries is hidden a bit deeper, but it's still pretty easy to find through the settings section. Problem here is that this screen gathers all the libraries and their licenses together on a single screen. And apparently Google Maps uses a lot of libraries because this screen is really huge. On my phone it takes over 10 seconds to open. So I believe we can treat it as a really good anti-pattern how to comply with this obligation in matter of performance and user experience. Some applications take a different approach, and instead of bundling this information inside, they just link to that information to some external web page with that information of all the libraries. And from legal point of view, it's fine because we are obligated to inform our users what libraries we use. This form is okay. Although personally, I wouldn't recommend it because firstly, it probably won't be accessible when your device is offline or if the site is down. Also, we pretty often have or sometimes at least have different sets of libraries in different versions of our applications. So having such single point of truth source of truth means that for some versions this information may be inaccurate or simply wrong. And another example from Trello this time. Trello is a very simple but very also popular management tool. It is built around boards with lists of items. And in this case, they actually use their own tool to show this list. This screen in the middle you can see is Trello itself. I still prefer the first approach, which is simpler and more readable, but I find it pretty interesting idea. So, as you can see, in general, meeting this requirement of attribution is a very simple step. It's nothing hard to do. Very simple, however, very often ignored. I've seen really many applications which don't have such information, or at least I couldn't find it, but I looked pretty deeply. So maybe just get me this straight. If you are, let's say, Android developer, and you use such libraries as Dagger, RxJava, Realm, Picasso, and I bet you do, because they are the most common libraries in Android development. Or if you're a iOS developer, and you use Kingfisher, Alamfire, RxSwift, or Realm again, and I guess you also do, and you don't have such screen, you don't inform users that you don't use those libraries, then you don't comply with the license, and you break the law. Yeah, so seriously, every application should have such screen to follow this obligation. And legal side of this, legal is only one side of this issue. There's also matters of, I don't know, ethics or decency. Well, since we base on someone's effort who spent his time to build something which came out to be useful for us, it's simply decent to show some gratitude and credit the author. So in general, yes, we can use all those permissive licenses in our applications, even commercial ones. Just please remember about attribution. Things get more difficult with the second subcategory of open source, which this time is copyleft. Sometimes it's also called protective open source. The most notable examples of licenses from this family are GNU General Public License, GNU Lesser Public License, or also, for instance, Eclipse Public License. A crucial difference between copyleft and permissive licenses, on general level, is the fact that if we use some software released under copyleft license, then we are obligated to publish our own software under the same license. Since we are talking about open source licenses, in practice it requires us to open source of our application, which again is not an issue in commercial projects. For sure, this is rule of the thumb for the first one, GPL license, which is the most prominent representative of this family. For instance, Linux kernel or GCC compiler has been released under this license. There are some licenses in copyleft group which are thought as kind of compromise between copyleft or permissive licenses. For instance, this lesser general public license, LGPL, which are thought to be more commercial friendly. However, as we did some research in the internet, we saw many very different opinions about it. It wasn't conclusive, so eventually we have consulted our lawyer, and in general he discouraged us from using any copyleft licenses in commercial projects. So, although you can find some probably opposite opinions in the net, at our company we decided not to use them. So, if you can afford it, I mean, if there's no, then definitely don't use it. Yes. So, in general, regarding copyleft software, we shouldn't be using it commercially, as it requires us to publish our source code, unless it doesn't. And I mean, it's maybe not that clear, but here there's no black and white, because there are really many different cases. It's about the form of your application, it's about the form of the software you want to apply, the way of distribution, and some others. So if there's if you find some library released under copyleft license, which you really need, then I suggest consulting your lawyer to have conclusive, certain opinion about it. Next group to cover is our proprietary licenses, very often referred as just closed sourced. In general, in this case, we don't have rights to such software. They are fully held by maintainer. If we want to use it in our project, we have to grant such rights from the owner of the software. They are usually distributed in compiled form, so we have no access to the source code, so we cannot modify them in any way. So, by default, we cannot use such software unless we got it based on some agreement with the author. For instance, we simply bought it, and this agreement allows us to do. but by default, we can't use it. Next group I just want to cover, so we have full picture of all possible groups of licenses or groups of software, is trade secret. Trade secret is much broader notion. It's not actually about only about software. It's in general about any kind of information that is generally not known to the public, which gives some sort of benefit to its holder, and is also subject of some efforts to maintain its secrecy. So just from this definition, you can see that trade secret software is not something we can accidentally find in the net and unconsciously use. If you ever get access to some trade secrets software, it's usually based on some agreement with some other entity, some company or person or something like that. And that agreement explicitly states if and how you can use such software. So by default, no, we can't use such software commercially unless we have agreement which allows us to. And eventually, case I've already mentioned, what if we have we find some software and it has no license information? So as I'm going from the least to most restrictive cases, you've probably already guessed that yes, such software is fully copyright protected, and from legal point of view, we cannot use it. Sorry. Even if it is hosted on some site which allows for viewing and forking source code, like GitHub or Bitbucket, it does not imply that we can use it. From legal point of view, we can't. So what options do we have in such case? Firstly, we can ask maintainer to add a license. If it's open source, there's a pretty high chance it was intention of the author for others to use it. Maybe they just forgot to add a license, or they just don't know they should. So if such code is for instance, on GitHub, you can create an issue or even create a pull request with some suggested license. Maybe it will be merged and you will be fine to go. Another option is to negotiate a private license. It is doable. You have to contact the author, but probably in that case you will need to consult your lawyer to do it properly. If none of those options work for you, then sorry, you can't use it. So no license, no, we can't use it commercially, as no usage rights are granted by the license in this case. So here's the summary of those groups, those licenses. So public domain we can use unconditionally. Permissive licenses pretty much as well, just please remember about attribution. Regarding copyleft, think deeply about it. About proprietary or trade secret, by default we can't use it unless we have some agreement which allows us to. And no license, no usage. In mobile development, probably around 95% cases you will deal with permissive licenses. MIT, Apache, BSD, so you can use them, sure. In other cases, that probably will be this copyleft licenses, GPL or LGPL, or no license at all. So please beware of those cases. So that was theory. So now also let me give you some hopefully practical tips. How can we approach this topic in mobile development in practice? Yeah. So how does our development process usually look like? So we are happily coding our great application, adding more and more features every day. Then out of a sudden some problem arises. Let's say you have to implement some dependency injection or maybe some mechanism to fetch and cache images or encrypt, decrypt data in some specific algorithm. Sure, we are great developers, we can make it easily, but we are also practical and we prefer spending this 20-50 minutes playing table soccer, and we look for some library to do it for ourselves. Usually it's not that big problem, we just search it, first pick from Google usually is the one. So we try it, we integrate it, even maybe check if it works. If so, yeah, then hooray, our work is done and we can get back to coding. So that's the standard way we do it, I think. So no, please don't do it that way. That's not a good way to do, at least not the full way, as there are some extra steps we should always execute here. So let's try again, this time in good way. So we are coding, adding more and more features. Some problem arises, and we find some library which probably solves that problem. But then we get this sudden flashback from the past that once I've attended this great conference, and that guy has threatened me that if I don't check the license, then I may act against the law and be a criminal. Surely I don't want to be a named criminal, so I better check it. So how can we do it? In most cases, it's more than easy. On Android, you probably use Maven repository as some dependency repository. So on this artifacts page, this information is very clear. Right on the top, it's very hard to miss what license that library uses. On iOS and CocoaPods, this information maybe is not that clearly exposed, but still you can find it easily on the right section of the screen. If you don't use any of those repositories, and the such library is open sourced, then check the source code. In general, if library is released under some license, it should contain this information in its source code. The convention here is to put it into license.txt file in root folder of repository. Okay, so we already know what license it is. If there's no license, if we couldn't find it anywhere in repository, in source code, maybe in documentation, then as we discussed, no, you can't use such library. Otherwise, there's another question. Okay, I know what library it is, but can I use it in my project? If it is one of those most common libraries like Apache, MIT, or GPL, you probably already know the answer, as I have mentioned them before. But there are hundreds of licenses on the market, some with very, very specific requirements. Some companies create some licenses just for them. So how can we know what exactly they obligate us to do? So obvious answer, read the license. All information you need is there. But problem here is, as you guess, those texts tend to be very long, very formal, and not that clear for someone not used to such kind of language. Luckily, there are some websites to the rescue. First one I would like to recommend you is choosealicense.com. It has very nice appendix of over 30 common licenses. For each of them, it answers some crucial questions. Most important from our point of view, I mean from commercial point of view, are if we are obligated to disclose the source code of our application, if we apply some library released under that license, and if we have to release it under the same license, which in commercial usage usually is not something we want. By the way, choosealicense.com, this website is curated by GitHub and integrated with it. So if on GitHub you will open license.txt file, you will see this extra section on the top with nice summary of this license and obligations and restrictions it brings. If you won't find your license on choosealicense.com, you can also try this page, tldrlegal.com. By the way, if you're not familiar with internet slang, TLDR means too long didn't read, which is probably common experience if you deal with software licenses. That site contains over 400 different software licenses explained in plain English, so I believe you should find your license here with the explanation. Okay, so we already know what license we are dealing with. We know if we can use it in our application. If we can't, then back again, we need to search something else. Otherwise, there's one more step, last one. As we already said, we need to document it. We need this license, this list of libraries our application uses. So whenever we add or remove some library, we should update it. Even if you're back here, you can see that almost all the licenses have this requirement of attribution, that we have to inform our users that we use it. And again, even if they don't require it, for instance, public domain does not require us to inform about its usage, it's still simply decent or good thing to do. Luckily, we don't have to create and maintain such list manually. There are some libraries and plugins which can help us with that. On Android, first thing you will probably find is this Gradle plugin from Google. It auto-detects all the libraries used by your application and provides some activity enlisting all of them. Sounds good, but personally I wouldn't recommend it because it has its flaws. Firstly, as you can see here, it enlists only the names of Maven artifacts, not the actual names of the libraries, so it's not that readable. Secondly, it has almost no configuration options. The only thing you can change here is the title of the screen. And lastly, after clicking it, we don't see the license, it's just this link to the license. Again, not the best user experience. But luckily there are some alternatives to this, even many alternatives, actually some open source libraries helping us with that. We at our company use two of them, which I can recommend. First one is About Libraries library, which is probably the most popular one, at least looking at the number of forks and stars on GitHub. It also auto-detects libraries your application uses, but it also comes with nice descriptions of those common libraries, commonly used in Android development. You can also easily extend it, add another libraries or with their descriptions, and you can also customize the screen appearance. If you don't like the idea of auto-detection and you prefer having full control on which exactly libraries show up on this list, you may use, for instance, Attribution Presenter, the second one we use at our company. They also contain information about most popular libraries and licenses. It has very nice API to use and also some UI customization options. On iOS, first thing to note is that if you are using Coco Heads, there is actually a playlist file already generated for you. It lists all the libraries your application uses. Then you can use that file to create to add such a list to settings bundle of your application. It's all documented on CocoPods site. If you prefer having this information as a separate screen of your application, not in the settings bundle, you can try, for instance, AcnoList library, which also bases on this file generated by CocoPods and provides such a screen for use. If you are using some other dependency managers also available on iOS, you can create and maintain this list manually or also look for some scripts doing it automatically. They are pretty easy to find in the net. So, we've identified our license, we've confirmed that we can use it, we've also updated the list of the libraries used in our applications. Then, now, with clear conscience, we can finally get back to the coding. Yeah. So, I hope you have more or less clear view how to approach any library you will find in the net, taking its license into account. Getting back to those two cases I've identified, which are the most common ones in software development. If you're thinking about releasing some software and you're thinking, what license should I use? So all that knowledge, all this information I just gave you, it of course applies here as well. These are still the same licenses with the same restrictions and obligations. So if you want to keep your code to yourself, you want to close it, you will probably use some kind of proprietary license, this closed source. In that case, you will probably consult it with the lawyer if you didn't do it already. If you want to contribute to the open source, then sure, choose one of many open source libraries. If you need help with it, I can recommend again choosalicense.com. I'm not related in any way with this site, I simply believe it provides pretty good set of information. So as its name claims, choosalicense.com, its main purpose is to advise in what license we can use and apply to our software. So just let me, that's all I have prepared. Now just let me remind some information I would like you to take away from this presentation. Firstly, always check the license. Secondly, if you don't find it, don't use such software. Don't assume it's public domain and you can do anything with it. You can't. Next, in general, avoid copyleft licenses, at least if you want to keep your code closed. And eventually, always list all the libraries you use. So that's actually all I got. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. How do you deal at Miquido with code snippets flying around in the internet, for example, on Stack Overflow?
With what code, sorry?
Code snippets.
I'm not I guess that's a matter of the license agreement. The license, not the license, the let's say license, the rules which are part of Stack Overflow. I'm not exactly sure under what license, under what copyright this stuff you put on Stack Overflow is accessible in the internet. I would assume it's publicly accessible. I mean, kind of open source. You could use it freely. So in general, I think the general rule is that if you find something on Stack Overflow, you simply use it. Copyright does not apply here. That would be my answer.
Okay, thank you.
So just to answer that, I think Stack Overflow has a license at the bottom, which is some type of Creative Commons license that applies to everything.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
My question is actually, have you come across any of the more exotic licenses? Like, I've seen a few libraries use something like do whatever you want license, which is definitely not written by a lawyer, which, at least in some companies, is something that's frowned upon.
Personally, I haven't. The most exotic examples were, well, this LGPL, which is not that exotic, but we faced it a couple of times. And there's also was case of dual license, which says because you can release your application under 2 different licenses, which means that you can choose one of them for your usage. These were actually the most exotic examples. I think I've read somewhere about this license you're referring to, but we didn't came across it in our company.
Thank you.
Thanks for talk. I have a question. Can the license be changed between versions?
There is an open source guide. I think it's also created by GitHub, where there's a really long section about it, answering that question. It begins with, it's complicated. In general, it depends on many things, like from which license to which license you would like to change it. Also, there's a question who actually can do it, because in open source there are many contributors, so theoretically they all should agree about it. So it is possible, but complicated. There's no one general rule or answer for that.
So I should always check the license when I want to update the framework, right? Just to be,
That's to make safe yourself. I mean, to ensure that it hasn't changed during that time.
Exactly. Okay, thanks.
Probably, yeah. It's very rare situation, but theoretically it happens. Any other questions?
One more question, actually. Do you include anyhow the license check process in the CI/CD? So, because the plugins that you mentioned, they are kind of generating the information about licenses that you use already, yes, right? But we know how the organizations work, and we have a lot of developers, right? and we want to ensure actually that like an invalid license that we don't want to use gets used actually, right? So do you have any gatekeepers that prevent that on the, I don't know, pull request level or something like that?
That's something we're currently working on. So far we came up with some scripts which simply scan all our repositories, look at the files and check what exactly libraries we use and list down all the licenses of them, fetching that information from the repositories. And then we just check it manually at this point, but we are thinking about automating it, indeed.
Okay, thanks.
One more?
Yes, hi. When it comes to the list of the licenses that you have to put in your application, what kind of data you have to put there? Is it enough to have the library name and the license name, or you have to put a link to the license, or you have to put the license content? Because as you shown in Google Maps, the whole licenses are included.
Yes. Well, it may slightly differ between different licenses because there are some differences among open source libraries. In general, the safest way to approach this is to list all the libraries and their license content. Then you are guarded.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, some of the licenses actually they state that you need to include the license text as part of the software.
Anybody else? Okay, so in that case, thank you very much.